Joining us for a conversation around the President's address at the United Nations General Assembly via Zoom from New York, where the UN headquarters is located, is Mr. Femi Adesina, who is Special Advisor for the President on Media and Publicity. Mr. Adesina, we're glad to have you this morning.
Good morning, and I'll say good morning, Nigeria.
Here with us in the Abuja studios, we'd like to welcome Professor Abiodun Adeniyi of Base University.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. And also we have in the studio here Honorable Sam Onyugo. Pardon? Onoigbo. You're welcome, sorry for that slip. He's the President, Globe International, Globe Nigeria, and a member representing Ikona Umar here in North and South Federal Constituency at the House of Representatives.
Good morning.
You're welcome.
Yes, yeah.
We are really waiting for, Dr. Abdurrahman Abu Hamisu, who shall be joining us here in the studio too. In a moment he comes in, we will really take him up and then we'll continue our discussion. Kisley?
All right. Thank you very much. We'll listen to excerpts of the President's, as it were, valedictory address to the United Nations General Assembly. Professor Abiodun Adeniyi, what do you make of the ambience and the delivery by the President?
Okay, thanks for the invitation. I took my time to go through that speech completely. And I want to look at the speech from two angles. First, from character, and then from the content of the speech. From character, of course, it ticked all the boxes in terms of clarity, in terms of presentation, in terms of presidential pause, and in terms of keeping to a known pedigree, of being, sartorial in public spheres like that, especially the international space. So in terms of character, of course, I can say it's well above average. And of course, in terms of content, the President provided an helicopter view of all the problems, not just bedeviling Nigeria or Africa, but of course the developing countries as well. He talked about the rise of non-state actors, climate change, migration, and some other issues like that. The key observations I can make, from both paradigms really is that much unlike last year's speech was actually longer than this year's speech. Much unlike last year's speech, and the President, was slightly diplomatic. Perhaps this is strategic. He focused less, on the problems bedeviling the country, particularly, and providing a generic view of, the rampaging perils, troubling developing countries. Perhaps to prove that there's no problem that is happening in this country that is peculiar to this country. The problems, associated with developing countries are evident in individual developing nations, And of course, he proceeded from that, and pleaded for support, international financing, support, for, the pandemic that is still raging in circles, and how we proceed to manage post-COVID crisis, as the case could be. So overall, I think, it's just fall in line with expectations of what a presidential speech should be, in a general assembly like that, Nothing exemplary, nothing outstanding, and nothing dramatic was ordinarily expected, Of course, hardly can we even see anything dramatic, in a general assembly speech. One of the most memorable drama we've ever had was the one by Fidel Castro in 1960, where he spoke for about 4 hours, around at the time of the controversial crisis, Cuban crisis, etc., the revolution, blah, 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 like that. And of course, countries that are wont to making controversial speeches might be countries that are directly in war, war situations, or crisis around land, crisis of nationhood, Palestine, Holy See, and all of that. And of course, for us, Nigeria, our president speaking, we do not expect any rebuttal coming from another nation. Sometimes rebuttals can come essentially from countries that are also similarly controversial, maybe Palestine, or countries that are in war, maybe Russia, Ukraine, or countries, where territories are being challenged, like Taiwan, Pakistan versus India, for instance. But for us, we are somewhat on a steady flow. The major crisis we face are crises of development around economics, around politics. And it was also gratifying, very instructive that he had done the question of transition. He has been there for 7.5 years preparing to leave, and he's determined to bequeath a legacy of salutary elections, as he has supposedly done in the last couple of years. He had done that, and of course, he was slightly personal when he said this was going to be the last. This is going to be the last time he's going to speak. He's going to face the United Nations, of course, like a farewell, so to say. So overall, I think it fits all the beats, all the bills. We're not expecting something dramatic, something really radical, as the case could be. Essentially asking the developing nations, because it's a platform for him to make demands, to be more concerning in terms of support for developed nations. Asking developed nations, to be much more concerning in terms of supporting the developing nations, as the case could be. And of course, Nigeria is a prime country among developing nations, emerging from the from continental Africa.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Adeniyi. We're not expecting much, at least from the president, as much as he spoke yesterday. Honorable Sam, Adeniyi said he was giving us a helicopter view of, the president's speech. Let me just modernize it a little. Maybe if you can give us the drone view, if I may add, okay, of, the president's speech, given what he said.
If I can
just view, right, of what the president said. He talked about so many things: small arms, climate change, the change in the United Nations, urgently needed, the wars, the insecurity, and so many of them. Give us your own perspective of this speech.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And again, thanks for the invitation. My view about the president's speech is simple. It was classy in that he picked on critical national and global issues and brought them to the fore. And that way, he wasn't speaking to entertain anybody. Because if you go through the speech, beginning from, acknowledging the change that has occurred at the UN in terms of the new leadership, and then going down the line, talking about particularly that you are going to have a free, fair, and credible elections that will produce a successor. So, coming from the angle of those early views by thinkers on the importance, thinkers like James Harrington and all that, on the importance of succession and tenure, and why constitution of a nation and term limits should be sacrosanct. He harped on that, and he identified it as one of the problems that lead to instability and fights when you have sit-tight leaders who want to alter constitutions. And so that was very profound, because he has known, he has seen, he has experienced that that's been responsible for the challenges that we have had, particularly around the sub-region. And he also talked about the issue of nuclear disarmament. And of course, by the time he made that speech yesterday, he never knew that President Putin was going to make a veiled threat about using nuclear weapon. So these are far-reaching issues. And of course, he dwelt extensively on climate change, realizing the challenge that poses globally and nationally. Because I must say that he's been consistent on this issue. Because beginning from the 29th of May, 2015, when he made his inaugural speech, he did say that he was going to fight climate change. And I recall very clearly that in 2015, I was opportuned to travel with him for the COP21, where the Paris Agreement on climate change was adopted. And he followed that up with his visit to so many other countries, where in every of his speech, he talked about climate change. He was also there in Marrakesh in 2016. And at the UN, a similar visit in 2016, on September 22nd, I was also lucky to be there with him, where he signed the Paris Agreement on climate change. So, and he has gone further to assent to the climate change bill, which fortunately God helped me to sponsor, because I recall that that bill had defied so many other sessions, so many other presidents, until it got to his time. So for those things that he was able to itemize, and then to talk about the challenge that came from COVID and why we have to work together, you know, as a global nation to solve problems, just like we were able to solve the COVID problem, which perhaps if it had been contained within where it came from, it probably wouldn't have become a pandemic. So these things point to the fact that the world needs to work together and begin to address challenges that I imagine, whether they are those of the small arms or actions that are coming from non-state actors that have now led to some kind of organized serious crimes across the nations. You can see what we refer to as the Sahel region. We are not only talking about the drought and desertification that are coming and threatening us, but you are seeing that with the drought and desertification and the challenges of climate change, people have moved, carried arms, have pushed down to different parts, you know, of this region. That's also keys into the efforts that the Nigerian nation has made, you know, with the Great Green Wall, on how to tackle climate change, problems coming out of Lake Chad, and why we must address all those things. Because individuals who previously depended on a place like Lake Chad for survival today do not have anywhere to go for their minor skills, you know, like farming, animal husbandry, and fishing, and therefore they have poured into the cities. So we believe that this speech is it captures the moment, and hopefully we'll be able to use this speech to address some other outstanding issues.
All right. Thank you very much, Honorable Nubo. Well, let's go back to Femi Additional. We saw him a moment ago on the screen. If he's still there with us via Zoom, yes, he's there on the right side of the screen. Mr. Femi Additional, tell us how different was the president's speech this time from previous UN General Assemblies at which he had been present?
Thank you. That's a nutty question. In that, yes, I've been fortunate to be part of all the president's appearances at the United Nations General Assembly. Yesterday was the 7th physical one. It will have been the 8th, but in 2020, it was done online. Because of COVID-19, there was no physical gathering, so it was an online meeting. But I'll say that, yes, compared to the previous speeches, this was the final one. It was like a farewell speech. I remember that some 6-7 years ago, President Obama gave his final address to the UN at the last year of his term. So it's in place for presidents to do that without sounding a bit patronizing, because in a way I was part of the making of the speech and of the entire process, so I may not be the best person to assess it. But I'll say yes, the cadence was good, the delivery was smooth, and it just resonated quite well with those who are listening, both within the UN General Assembly Hall and internationally. From the feedbacks I've got, people are quite satisfied with that speech. I spoke with Professor Muhammadu Bande, who used to be a president of the General Assembly and Nigeria's permanent representative to the United Nations. And he says the feedback that he got from that speech has been positive.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Femi Adesina there. And then you said it's the seventh speech reading, of course, which is the fact of the truth about the president's speech at the United Nations, and of course, the last as president of Nigeria. While we were just watching and listening to you, Abdurrahman Abu Hamisu just came in, and of course, he is a political scientist and a public affairs analyst. You're welcome to Good Morning, Nigerians.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Thank you so much. Before we rather go around again, let's hear you just came right at the nick of time. We're just trying to really have, perspectives on the president's speech and what exactly it holds for Nigeria and the world. And then Femi Adesina just said as you stepped in, that's the seventh president's speech, and of course we all know it's the last president of Nigeria. Give us your own perspective about Abu Hamisu. Give us, you've been watching as Femi Adesina was asked, really put to you straight. How different has this seventh speech been with the sixth and the ones before it?
Well, I think the president's speech was issue-based. I think the speech tries to capture almost all the things that needed to be addressed, from climate change to issue of insecurity to global peace and so on and so forth. So for me, it is a speech that really talked to the issues that are really disturbing the world, that is affecting the world. The only thing was, whether it is an oversight or what, I don't know. Libya was omitted.
Libya?
Yes, Libya was omitted.
All right.
In terms of the trouble spots that he mentioned that needed to be tackled. And then he talked about Ukraine. But for me, if I'm to prioritize, I think I will speak to issues that affect us directly, especially the Sahel, and then the arms that are coming through Libya that is really posing serious challenge to us in terms of access to these very particular A-grade weapons that are used for kidnapping, for terrorism, and so on and so forth. But again, it has to do with prioritization. And then I think that is just the only gap that I see if I am to talk about security, insecurity within the global framework. He talked about Palestine, he talked about Ukraine.
But he talked about small arms and light weapons.
Yes.
Proliferation.
Yes.
There will be a subtext that Libya had previously been a source of such small arms and light weapons.
Of course, as a farewell speech, you need to underscore that. And we even need to hold those people that orchestrated that very particular fiasco responsible and accountable. It is something that we cannot keep at the back burner, because something that is affecting us directly. You can't talk about Sahel today without talking about Libya, without talking about Yemen, because most of these arms from Yemen down to South Sudan, down to Libya, they all find their ways one way or the other to the shores of this country. So I'm saying that, though you mentioned issues around terrorism, but I'm saying that it is not something that we just have to let go. If Ukraine has become a burning issue, far away Ukraine, that though there are consequences because of the interdependence that we have as a world, but then if we're talking about the one that is impacting us most right now, is Libya. So we can't afford to allow Libya to rest.
Is it so much about, I know the point you're making, Dr. Abu Hamisu. Is it so much about the sole role or contributory role of Libya, as it is some persons would argue that part of the conflict that we are seeing is in the Sahel today is an orchestration by some leading powers in the globe?
Yes. That is the point.
And that's less about Libya. Yes. Even though that Libya has virtually disintegrated since the end of the Gaddafi era. But what the crisis you are seeing, you have seen the actions taken by Mali, you've seen the protests lately in Niger Republic. Those ones, they're not speaking about Libya, are they?
You see, if you stabilize Libya, our problem is 60% solved. Because the arms that got into Libya to topple Gaddafi are the arms that we're still dealing with. And now, people can protest. It's allowed. Once it is not violent, that is what democracy is all about. It's about pressure. But once you make weapons available to people that are protesting, you just add fuel to the fire. This is the point. So if you stabilize Libya today, I assure you 60% of the issues we are dealing with in Sahel will be solved. Because it was the spillover from Libya that led to what is happening in Mali. The Tuaregs that were recruited to remove Gaddafi went back home with cash and weapons. And that is destabilizing Mali. So what we are saying is, if we are able to stabilize Libya, and then we're able to curtail the arms flow, now people can protest peacefully. Nobody is saying anybody should not protest. But what we are saying is, don't give somebody who is aggrieved access to weapon, not just ordinary weapon, A-grade weapons. The same weapon that a nation state is supposed to use is the same weapons that the non-state actors are using.
Okay. I don't so thanks.
Yeah.
I want to go back to Femi additional. Femi, I would like you to, if you may, respond to what Abu Hamisu has said, but give us a sense of what the mood is like at the United Nations General Assembly. And I'm asking this question against the backdrop of two global developments. One, which of course everybody's dealt with, that is the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. But more crucially, is the war in Ukraine. That is the Russian invasion and occupation of parts of Ukraine. What has that created in the UN optics? And if I may throw in the third one, are people hearing the drum beats of war over Taiwan? Because the US is already saying that it will back Taiwan against any Chinese invasion. What is the mood like?
No, the first two I got. The third one was what again?
First two you got. Namely, I said, what's the mood like at the United Nations General Assembly?
Yes.
The backdrop, one, of the passing of Queen Elizabeth, the second,
Yes.
and that, of course, more crucially, which is lingering, the war in Ukraine. Russia, it's a leading global power. And the third one, which I threw in, it's the drumbeat of war over Taiwan. The U.S. saying that it will defend Taiwan against any invasion by China.
Okay. Well, if I can start from the third one, I have not seen the issue of drumbeats over Taiwan resonate too loudly, at least from the presentations we've had so far. Unlike Russia and Ukraine. Yes, Russia and Ukraine has featured in almost every speech. Almost every speech. You heard that President Biden dwelt extensively on Russia and Ukraine and why it will be futile for anybody to start a nuclear war, because he says it's not a war anybody will win. It's a war that will lead to mutual assured destruction, and that one is an ill wind that will not blow any good for the world. So that has featured in most speeches. It featured even in our own president's speech, and almost every speaker has spoken about that, which is also the very essence of the United Nations. Global peace, global unity, global amity. So almost every leader that has spoken about the Russia-Ukraine war. The mood vis-a-vis the passage of the Queen. I think with the burial of the Queen on Monday, that has put a closure to that. You see that the attention of the world was riveted on the United Kingdom. Of course, the Queen had been there 70 years. The world may never see a personality like that again. She was a genial person. She was a woman of dignity, and the attention of the world was focused there. But that moment on Monday, when that coffin was lowered into the final resting place, I think brought some closure to that issue. So it was very important that.
Okay, since we've really lost Femi Adesina there, when he comes back again, we just take it up from where he stopped. But in the meantime, Professor Adeniyi, he has started talking about the Ukraine, Russia, and then how all this, this appeared in almost every speech. And coincidentally, when the President Biden was speaking, there was this, shot from Russia. Putin was also speaking right there in his country, talking about, put bluntly, if need be, they could use nuclear weapons against anybody that touches their territory anymore, anytime. Especially after the the referendum taking place in a couple of days in this annexed regions of Ukraine. Now, these are just, I cannot say it's a coincidence, because I may not know the reason behind that, but we all believe that these are just things that are going to have some global impact. And just like Biden said, it won't do anybody any good, nuclear war, and that's the belief everywhere else. So what do you make out of this seeming coincidence?
Well, seeming coincidence, like you said, but sometimes you want to doubt whether it was actually a coincidence. International politics is usually high stake, and of course we're talking about superpowers here. We're in a largely bipolar world. Well, of course that identity is being dissolved now. Because we probably overestimated the power or the prowess of Russia. Earlier on we thought they were going to overrun Ukraine only in 4 days, but of course Ukraine has mounted very good resistance. That somewhat challenges, the belief around, the omnipotence, so to say, of Russia, as the case could be. But of course, they are still very dangerous, and of course, particularly that leader is probably still very dangerous. He's been hemmed in now, and of course, if I want to express himself, by blowing out in a manner in which we will not expect. But the statement has been made very clearly that resort to nuclear weapon is not going to help anybody, and the least person that who can imagine that it will help will be Russia. Well, that's why we think that common sense should rather prevail. And do not forget that United Nations speeches, UNGA speeches, are largely showpieces, and they're largely ceremonial, largely symbolic. But of course, through those symbols, we'll see expressions of nations, the potency of nations, the ability of nations to demonstrate their cadence, their ability on the world, their capacity on the world stage. So when nations make pronouncements like that, signals are sent, to listeners, and principal listeners are probably contemporaries, competitors. So if the US president is talking, for instance, the one that will receive it more, that should feel it more, should be Russia, because they are, so to say, military contemporaries, and if they are reacting the way Putin has reacted, we shouldn't be surprised. But overall, I'm not also surprised that every nation is talking about the Russia-Ukraine war. Not because of the condition as it is, but the manner in which it could snowball. And nobody wants the annihilation of the world or the extermination of Russia, as the case could be. Because if it goes nuclear, we know that it's not the only owner of nuclear weapons. There are many nations around him that also own nuclear weapons, and of course, when more are massing against one, it could even be much more catastrophic. But nobody wants that, and that's why nations will continue to emphasize it. Because it's an expression, it's a platform for nations to express themselves, and in expressing yourself, of course, you are pointing at the greatest danger to humanity, as the case could be. And the greatest danger often comes from an atmosphere of intransigence, has been reflected by Russia, rightly or wrongly. Warfares, when they begin, you probably know when they begin, but you may not know at the end of the day how it's going to end. And the thing to do in the initial circumstance is to do everything possible to prevent it. And that's what I think world leaders are doing. So it's a right step in the right direction. But are we going to have reason in the circumstance? Will reason prevail? I mean, it's just an expectation, maybe a noble expectation from all right-thinking people across the world. But how to pan out still remains in the womb of time.
All right, thank you, Professor Adeni. Honorable Adeni, but let's bring you again into the conversation. When you content analyze the president's address of the assembly, there were linkages he provided. For instance, in referencing the conflict in Ukraine, it did also talk about the need for a global agenda, a global agreement on nuclear disarmament, not just amongst the big powers. But it also underscored, in my view, the greater consequences of the conflict in Ukraine. We have seen the pressure on us, for instance, as a country, as a result of the crisis in Ukraine, wheat costs and what that means for the confectionery and bakery businesses. We've seen the cost of oil and its and many derivatives and all that. But in Europe, we have also seen the consequences in the spiraling energy prices that they're having to deal with. I'm just wondering, because that was the reason I asked Premier Addition on that question, about the mood at the United Nations relating to the conflict in Ukraine. If there is no let-up in that conflict, or if there is indeed an escalation, it appears that every other issue that we are talking about and everyone brings to the table, whether it's climate change, whether it's this or that, we just get into the back burner, and then what we are dealing with will be the consequences of the conflict. Have world leaders taken cognizance of this, or is this an attempt to say you want to humiliate Russia, to say, oh yeah, you thought you could do this and get away with it? It's virtually, Russia has virtually destroyed parts of Ukraine, and it's going to be costly to rebuild that country.
Yes, your analysis of the speech as it touches on these critical issues is very much in order. I would just point out before I proceed that the impact on us is supposed to be both positive and negative. Negative in the sense that it has affected, the price of wheat and bread and all that. It's supposed to be positive in the sense that it has also led to increase in the price of crude, petroleum-related items. It now depends on how we manage it and how we take advantage of the situation. So now going back to the issue of the crisis in Ukraine, I do not think that anybody truly wants to humiliate Russia. But I think that in an interconnected world where the focus of the UN has always been on peace and security, development and human rights, that it's a little bit out of place for a nation, particularly, one of the members of the Security Council, to just wake up and invade another country. And when you do that, that is in violation of the principal reasons why we started the United Nations in 1945 after the Second World War. And perhaps, if you permit me, I could also talk about the last description of the superpowers or the Security Council votes. One vote equals to maybe 99 or more. Otherwise, if you know that sanctions will face you, that your actions will attract repercussions, you will not embark on such a reckless exercise. So we are facing a serious danger. Two things are involved. One is being started. The other one is the ego of the people who started the war. Are they prepared? As you can see, that it appears now that the tide is turning a little bit in Ukraine, where the Ukrainians have reclaimed some swaths of territory previously held by the Russians. So, and maybe that threat that this could go beyond there is why somebody's talking about deploying nuclear weapons if need be. So we need to get back and make the United Nations focus on its original reason or principles for its establishment. And that also links up with the speech of Mr. President when he talked about reorganize the United Nations. And he also stated that the change is long overdue. Otherwise, we would be seeing a situation where one country that considers itself powerful wakes up one morning and invades either its neighbor or even another country altogether without consequences. We need to address this together because the consequences are massive. Imagine disruption to global activities, just at the time when we thought we were recovering from the devastating effects of COVID-19. When the entire nations of the world were working on how to rebuild, the next thing that we had was invasion, despite our appeals not to do that. And look at the consequences on the entire world. The efforts that nations were making to recover, to rebuild, they have been more or less dashed. And that's why we need to stop this with some sense of precision early in the day before it gets totally out of control.
All right, thank you so much, Honorable Sam. Abu Hamisu, we were really short of time, but at least we will dwell a little bit on that. As he mentioned, the president spoke about, the reorganization in the United Nations, which has been like a perennial theme. He's been in there since he's been speaking to United Nations. It's a burning issue, and that's just making great reference to justice around the world, around the globe. Yes. Let there be justice. Yes. Let there be really full representation and acceptance of countries as real countries, not other countries anyway. Mm-hmm. This resonates so much and sends a message to the United Nations and indeed the world that Nigerian president, all right, is very much keen about that. But looking at other developments, when you look at the belligerence of Israel, looking at North Korea, looking at China, and looking at maybe Iran thereabout, and some other country that may not seem to have, or be towing the same line with the West, and indeed not really fully aligned to Russia, but having been non-aligned. And we haven't had them speak yet. Even if they did, I didn't hear the speeches anyway, but I know there are going to be some strong reactions to that. What do you make out of the president's insistence of the United Nations, reorganization?
Well, if there is anything that has affected the workings of the United Nations, it is the penchant of the big players, the superpowers, those that have nuclear weapons, to use the United Nations as a cover to pursue their own agenda. And this has affected the United Nations mostly. The second part has to do with the veto that these guys are wielding. Mm-hmm. Almost all the countries in the world will come together to say we're going to do A. Very few countries will say it is not possible. And so if you ask me, and I'm beginning to wonder, why do we even place much emphasis on this United Nations organization? You go there, you make speeches, you make resolutions that will be vetoed by few individual member countries, and then it stands. Now, let us not forget the fact that my brother here said something quite important, but we shouldn't lose sight of history. Mm. In 1962, the same America blocked Russian attempt to place some missiles on the soil of Cuba. And what was the concern? Our security.
Whose security?
American security.
Fantastic.
Their neighborhood.
Yes.
Mm. That was the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Mm. And then in 2022, Russia is still raising the same issue, that we don't want Ukraine to be part of NATO because you're going to have your missiles close to our borders, just the same way America raised it in 1962. And Putin went further to say, if this will happen, then it is an act of war. I even blame Zelensky by allowing his country to be used as a buffer zone to fight a war. No sane leader will do that, because the consequences of the war is on the people of Ukraine. What are they doing from Washington to Britain? We are supporting you with weapon. We are supporting you with weapon. We are supporting you with weapon. But who are the people that are being killed? Whose territory is being destroyed? These are fundamental questions. And so Russia has the right to say my security is threatened if America had that right in 1962. And so if we're talking about global peace, and the countries you mentioned, Iran, it's because Iran not going to believe that the United Nations cannot give them protection. And the only way they can be protected is to acquire missiles, just like the West. Because the only key to global dominance is the possession of lethal weapon. Ukraine is becoming the headline because we believe that there are two superpowers are clashing. And that is why Libya is not getting any traction. If assuming Britain, France are involved in say Libya, and then you have this axis, say Beijing, Russia, Iran, equally involved in Libya, then you will find the world shouting. Then Libya will become a thing of concern. We are concerned today because we are afraid of nuclear consequences of nuclear war breaking out globally. But they will never denuclearize. You are only, for instance, you are caged as a slave, and you are asking your master to give you the key, or to throw away, to open the gate and throw away the key. Two things will not happen, and I don't say how we are going to do it. One is they will not denuclearize. Mr. President talked about that because he understood that if you want global peace today, the first thing to do is to denuclearize. And nobody will be under any threat to go and start nuclear enrichment. And nobody will threaten anybody. The second thing is to reform the United Nations to make it democratic so that countries can take decisions and it will be binding. But when you have few countries, about 5 of them or 6 of them, are vetoing the entire proceedings of a United Nation, and that is a problem.
Yeah, that's right. That's the power allocated to the UN Security Council.
Yes.
And the president referenced that in his speech. He said, look, the rules of governance, the rules of engagement that were established in 1945 with the setting up of United Nations stabbed the world at that time. But that here we are, the world has moved. And we are having new challenges, we are having new orders, we are having a new dawn and a new deal. And of course, at that time in 1945, how many countries were independent? So you now have many more independent nations, many more independent voices, and their voices ought to be heard and not drowned out by the big powers who framed the rules in 1945. But there's one other issue that I would like us to touch on, if Femi Adesina is still there. Femi, I understand we can still catch you on this. The president talked about debt relief. And I also heard the UN Secretary General raise a very pertinent issue. And I hope that others will take a cue from that, just like President Buhari has done in part. The UN Secretary General, let me begin from his point. He said that the current global financial system is designed or was designed for the rich countries, and that they have held on to it not for the benefit of the rest of the world, but for the benefit of the rich nations, and that the world has to alter the current global financial system, just as we are having a campaign for the alteration of the governance arrangements of the UN General Assembly. But the U.S. Secretary General spoke about the global financial system, and some persons will link that to what the president also said about debt relief. That some of this debts that countries are having to carry arise from the, pardon this word, iniquitous global financial system. Is this an issue that we are likely to hear more about in the coming months and if not years? Femi.
Thank you. I think we have always heard about that. In many past UN speeches, that issue of debt relief had always come up. It had always come up. But before I dwell more on that, let me respond to something Dr. Amisu said on the Sahel and Libya. Yes, our president mentioned it in passing in his speech. He didn't quite dwell on it too much. But yesterday, after that speech, he had a bilateral session with former Nigerian President Muhammadu Yusuf, who now heads an initiative on, I think it is an AU or ECOWAS initiative on peace and development and governance in the Sahel region. And what they spent the time discussing were the issues of small arms, security, banditry, insurgency, all flowing into different countries from the Sahel region. You will find that countries along that belt, right from Mauritania to Burkina Faso, to Niger, to Chad, to Nigeria are all affected. So it's an issue for West Africa and countries along the Sahel line. Just for Dr. Amisu's information, that it was the subject of a bilateral meeting yesterday between former President Issoufou of Niger and our president. Then coming back to the issue of debt relief, it had always featured. There are some things that had resonated year after year in President Buhari's speeches. Debt relief was one of them. The structure of the United Nations was one of them. The Rohingya issue had also always featured. Even the Palestinian issue. So I think debt relief is something that we will continue to hear about until those countries holding the shorter end of the stick in that respect get some relief. Whatever relief we can get, the countries that are less endowed compared to the very rich ones can get will always be welcome. So it's something that will continue to feature.
Okay, thank you so much, Femi Additional. Gentlemen, we really have to cut it quick here, but I think it's going to be worthwhile to just give you maybe 30 seconds to tell us which were about. Let me start with Sam here. The solution so preferred, all right, and then the speeches made by this president, especially President Muhammadu Buhari. What in 30 or 45 seconds could you say is the impact of that on the ordinary Nigerian?
Well, it raises hope, particularly as far as the election is concerned. The president has left a few legacies, if you permit me to use that word. One is the Electoral Act 2022. And for him to say, we're going to have a free, fair, and credible election, and we are going to see my successor speaking here at the podium in next year.
Yeah.
That to me is a profound promise or declaration, a lofty declaration by the president of a nation.
Thank you very much.
The second is the issue of climate change. I do hope that by the time he comes back, he will now continue with the process of inaugurating the council, because he has already appointed a director general. But the council on climate change, as provided in the act, has to be inaugurated, because that's the law.
Abu Hamisu, 30 seconds.
For me, the president did a very fantastic job by really highlighting the issues that are bedeviling the global system. And then, as we know, we're talking about interconnected world where happiness, both good and bad, find a way of reaching some destination beyond where the actors are really taking their decisions. So for me, the issues are well marshaled, and then I hope that the person that will take over from him, since he said that was his last speech, will continue to put issues that affect us on the front burner. For me, it's a very wonderful speech that was well delivered.
Professor? Good speech, no doubt, above average, but of course, following from what the Brazilian president also said, and from what has been discussed here on the question of reordering or reorganizing the Security Council, we cannot get it on the platter of gold. It's important for us to go back once more to what the legendary Professor Bolaji Akemi recommended ages ago on the need for us to have the concert of medium powers as a successor to the non-aligned movement, which crashed directly or indirectly in the wake of the supposed end of the Cold War. Non-aligned concert of medium powers somehow will be needed on the international space, and the president would also do well, by maybe sending a message or asking or advising the next president, so to say, to think about this going forward. Nigeria is one of the strongest black nations in the world, and we can lead that initiative.
Oh, thank you so much, Kinsley. I'll give you 30 seconds to thank them. And then really...
I just remember what Professor Bolaji Akemi said at the time. They said a concert of medium powers on the black bomb. That we also needed to have a black bomb. But Professor Abiodun Adeni, Base University, deep appreciation for your contribution to our discussion this morning. Political scientist, public affairs analyst, Dr. Abu Hamisu, thanks a lot for being around. And Sam Onigo, member of the House of Representatives. It's been our pleasure having you join us for today's conversation. From New York, we were joined by Femi Additional via Zoom. He's the special advisor to the president of media and publicity. Femi, thanks a lot. I know that it's still small hours now, probably about yes, you're 5 hours behind us. Still, I believe, yes, September still. So you're 5 hours behind us. So do catch some sleep before the engagements of the day begin, and then safe journey back home. All right, it's Good Morning Nigeria live on the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority. We'll take a short break now. When we return, we'll take our second topic for discussion.